Yep.
And one, now that we've gone there. So I think Bob's early professional career, you could tell it best. You were reporter, actor, and lawyer.
Before we get started, can I do something for my daughter will kill me if I don't do this?
Sure.
Okay. Everybody act like you're having a really good time. Hands up. Wait a minute, one more. Okay, now a 5-second video. Ready? And go. Thank you.
So clearly publishing is a family business, right? It is. So Bob, tell us about, your early career that prepared you or gave you stories that you could write about.
I always start by telling people I'm one of 10 kids because it's just so unusual. And I always wanted to write. Since the 7th grade, I won't bore you with that far back, but I always wanted to write. And then I kind of chickened out. I was working for the LA Times, and I started seeing what the salary was of a reporter, and I was living in Los Angeles. I didn't know anybody. My family's from Northern California, and I just started getting more and more scared. And all my friends were going to law school and medical school, and some were going to the UCLA School of Law, and that was really close. And so I ended up going to law school. And I knew from, Barb's a lawyer, so she knows. I knew from day one that I didn't want to be a lawyer. But when you have 9 compulsive overachievers in your family, you don't quit. So I became a lawyer, and I started practicing law, and I always thought, because when I was in law school, when I was in my 2nd year, there was a really completely unknown writer by the name of Scott Turow, who wrote a book called The Harvard 1L, and he wrote it while he was in law school. So I thought, well, how hard can it be? And so literally, as I'm trying to go to law school, and I'm trying to write my first novel, I'm learning the tort of misrepresentation. And I'm memorizing this, right? A misrepresentation is a representation of a fact that the person makes, knowing said fact is false, expecting said fact to be relied upon, that is relied upon, and does cause detriment. And I memorized that because when I got out, I was going to sue Scott Turow. But I finished law school, I started practicing law, and there's that old saying, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, because I'm a moron. There was an author out there that was kind of a little better well-known named Scott Turow. And he wrote a book called Presumed Innocent. And he and John Grisham were in a fight about who created the legal thriller. And everybody said, the guy that wrote Perry Mason. But I thought, okay, you can practice law and write novels. Again, I memorized misrepresentation because it's not true. But the short of a long story is I practiced for about 13 years, and then I had one of those epiphanies, which we have all had in our lives, but you have to have a few years under your belt before you recognize it as an epiphany. And my epiphany came as I was laying in bed one morning in San Francisco. I had a little 2-bedroom house in San Francisco. My wife was beside me, and our 18-month-old son, Joe, was between us. And I went to get out of bed. It was a normal day, just like any other, and I went to get out of bed to go to work, and I put my feet on the floor, and I said, I can't do this anymore. And God loved my wife. God loved this woman, right? She's got an 18-month-old son, and she says to me, then we won't. And that was all I needed. We moved to Seattle, and I started writing novels.
You did, and it was, surprise, a legal thriller with a lawyer called, amazing, a lawyer called David Sloan.
Yes.
Right, and that's how Bob and I met, because one of the things that, the Poison Pen is going to be 35 in October. Thank you. And the thing that we do that I have enjoyed the most and I'm the most proud of is that we try to catch almost every first novel, whether it's a $7.99 paperback or an expensive hardcover. So we have followed the careers of, I can't even count how many authors over time. Michael Connelly, Lisa C., Mark Rainey, whatever, have signed all their first books for us. But you were special, and I can't even remember why. Why were you so special?
I have no idea. I'm not special in my family. Why was I so special?
It's your hair. Right. You can always find Bob in any crowd from the back of his head. It just drives me crazy. But in any case, so Bob, we got together with his first David Sloan. And how many of those legal thrillers did you write? It was like 6 or 7, right?
5. So I wrote 5. And when the 5th book came out, and I think this is sort of a lesson for everybody that's in the audience. How many of you were privileged enough to hear Wanda Morris speak yesterday? I wanted to ask this question, and I didn't get the chance. I wanted to ask, why didn't you quit? 13 years before she got a novel published, 90 rejection letters. Why didn't you quit? Well, what Barb's not telling you is 10 years of writing that first novel. When I finally was done, 42 rejection letters, right? So why didn't I quit? I think I think the answer is I'm stubborn. I am stubborn, and I kept saying, people kept saying, you're not going to make it. You're not going to make it. And I kept saying, watch me, watch me. And I think it's really important to just keep going forward, because this is a hard profession, and it doesn't get any easier when you get published. I think it gets harder because, here I am, and I'm being critically acclaimed for my David Sloan novels, and my publisher calls me up and says, the 5th novel, we're not going to put out in paperback. Now, this was back in 2010, and paperback was what genre writers lived on. And they said, we're not putting it out in paperback. And then they said, and you don't sell enough novels, so we're going to let you go. Now, if you see sort of the irony in those two statements, then well, of course I don't, but you're not, there's no sense banging your head against the wall. So here I was, 5 books out, and I was right back where I started. How do I make a living? What do I do? And my agent is really, really a caring, sympathetic person. And what she said to me was, buck up, write the next novel. Well, what am I going to write about? And I'm thinking about this, and I'm thinking about this, and I was down at Poison Pen, and I think it was when I came down to interview maybe Craig Johnson. Was that the time?
No, I think you were there to do a program for the Arizona Bar Association.
That's what it was. That's what it was. And Barb said, I'll never forget this, because when this came up, she said to me, where have you been? And I said, well, I don't have a book. And she said, I don't care. We have a relationship. Where have you been? And so I said, okay. And I went down and I did this event at the Arizona Bar, and she said, come with me. And she took me to her house, and we went out in the backyard, and she said, what is going on? And so I told her the story. And she said, well, do you have any ideas for another book? And I said, well, I kind of have this idea about this female homicide detective. And literally over the course of the next, I'd say maybe 2 hours, sitting out on her patio in Phoenix, Scottsdale, she and I plotted my sister's grave. And that's the book that exploded for me and really sort of put me on the map, because Amazon Publishing purchased it, and off we went.
It was wonderful, it really was. So at that point, it's time for Gracie to take over for Act 3. But I do hope that any of you in the audience who are aspiring writers will realize that perseverance is a huge factor in being successful. You had to think about starting over, once from your legal career and then once when your first books came to an end. So, but it also takes somebody like Gracie, who is an absolutely brilliant editor and publisher, to want to take you in start you off on your 10 million copy run. Yay.
Well, I don't know how to start from there, but I do want to start, I guess, when My Sister's Grave came into my life. I can't take credit for picking that book up. I started off my relationship with Bob, I was his publicist. And I remember when My Sister's Grave came in, and our editorial director at the time, Alan Turkis, my predecessor, said, wow, this dynamite book has come in, and this guy, he's been writing legal thrillers, and this is a police procedural, and it's a female cop in Seattle, and you should read it. And I read it, and it was just dynamite. It was like nothing that I had read. And I think that's because Tracy is such a special and unique character. And I remember the first time we met, and we talked to you about, well, here's where we think you could go with this.
It was, again, it was one of those moments in my life that now I can look back on and say, oh my God, that was the epiphany. That was another turning point in my life, because my agent called me up and said, Amazon Publishing wants to take you to lunch. And I was still thinking the big five in New York. Amazon Publishing wants to take you to lunch. What do you want to do? I said, okay, yeah, I'll go to lunch. So I went to lunch, and their building was at the corners of Thomas and Mercer, and it was in the restaurant down below. And I walked in, and there was probably 12 people seated around this long table. And other than Alan, I was the oldest person there by probably 15 to 20 years.
Not that much.
It was like being in a startup. They were telling me things I had never heard before. Who my audience was, where my audience was located, what kind of books my audience bought, what other authors that they bought, in addition to books I bought, how they could break me out, how they could do this, how they could do that. And all I remember was I walked out of that meeting, and I called my agent as I was walking back to my parked car. And I said, I don't care what they offer up front. That's where I want to be. That's where I want to go. And Meg said, okay, then that's what we're going to do. And then the next thing that was really interesting was Alan called me up and said, we want to put your book in this thing that we're just starting up called Amazon First Reads, which would give Prime readers a month in advance of the book coming out the chance to download your book for free. And I said, so what's the percentage of free that I get? And he said, Bob, I think this is going to be a really big thing. I think you should do it. So I called up my agent, and we talked it over, and I said, what do I have to lose, right? I mean, at this point in my career, what did I have to lose? And they did it, and by the time the book became eligible to be bought, so in 1 month, when it hit, the day that it hit, I had 15,000 reviews. And shortly thereafter, I had close to 50,000 reviews. I think now the book has something like 200,000 reviews or so. And the thing that I've come to realize and come to really understand is that if you really want to sell books, it's not about having an ad in the New York Times. It's not about being on a billboard in Times Square, which, for my ego, I love you guys for that. But what sells books is all of you turning to the person next to you and saying, have you read this book? Did you read this book? Did you read The Nightingale? Did you read? And you tell someone, and they tell someone, and they tell someone, and it just goes viral.
Well, I think that's really interesting. What I want to talk about is, we were certainly, when My Sister's Grave came in, we knew that this was a very special book, and we felt like we could do a really good job with it. But it was because it was a very special book. And at this point, we are 10 books in with Tracy Crosswhite. You just turned in manuscript 11, which will be out next year. This is our 18th book. I counted it up. It's 18 books you and I have worked on together.
Wow.
Tracy Crosswhite series is, it continues to be just, readers want to follow Tracy. And I'm curious, you had written David Sloan, who was a beloved character. You've got some other beloved characters you've written, which we'll talk about. But what do you think it is about Tracy Crosswhite that really just has garnered these millions of readers who have followed her through 10 books, because honestly, it is unusual for a series to last that long. You know, oftentimes series, even the most popular series, and Harry Bosch, very notable exception, but most series have kind of an arc and a life, and then it's time to try something new. And with Tracy, that hasn't happened. Yeah. And what do you think, I mean, what, as Tracy's creator, what do you think?
I think there's a couple of things, and I talked about this a little bit on the panel I was on the other day, and that is I had to learn how to listen. I had to take a step back and stop telling my characters what to do and just let them live. Just let them come to life. I had to realize by reading Stephen King's book on writing and talking to Diana Gabaldon up at the Surrey Writers Conference and asking Kristen Hanna when she wrote The Nightingale, and I called her up and said, Kristen, where did you get this story? And her answer was, sometimes great stories and great characters fall in our laps and we just have to get out of the way. Now, I didn't fully understand that until that moment when I sat down and I started thinking about this story I wanted to write, and Tracy Crosswhite started to speak to me and started to tell me the story. And I, rather than panic, rather than call my wife and go, I think I need to go to the hospital, I'm hearing voices, I just listened. And what was really, I think, scary for me, but also really very exhilarating, was Tracy was not the person I had imagined. She was not Bosch in a female body. She was a very human, scarred individual, a very scarred person that was trying to get past her past in order to live her life, in order to, and that is so many of us, right? And that's the thing that I've come to realize is we all have something in our lives that we are trying to get over. I'll let you in on a little secret. I'm terrified at this moment. All right? Because I have anxiety. I have low levels of anxiety. And it started when I had a stroke in 2016. And I don't know why I have it, but I have it. Right? And I have to get over it because this is my job. This is what I do. Right? And Tracy is that same person. All of us have something that we have to get over. We have to get past. And so when she started to tell me her history and what she had, she became very human to me and very raw and very honest. And I really think that's what people identify with.
Yeah, I think that is very true. And when I think about, you know, these 10 books, and there's very compelling cases in each one that Tracy is investigating. But I do think that one of the reasons that readers keep reading these books is because we've also grown with Tracy. Tracy's life has changed a lot. You know, when we met Tracy, she was, like you said, a very damaged single woman chemistry teacher turned police officer who never got over the murder of her sister, the unsolved murder of her sister, and became a cop so she could try to figure that out. And over the years, we've seen her, you know, she did figure out her sister's murder. We won't say how, there might be some people who haven't read My Sister's Grave, but she did figure that out. She fell in love. She got married, she's had a child, she's moved up the ranks at the police department, she's really become a voice for victims, and she's just a very real and human character, and I think that's something.
So let me say something. I realized you asked me what it was I recognized. So when Bob and I sat down on my patio, and he was trying to see his way forward, what I recognized was that he didn't have to write legal thrillers, that Bob is a born storyteller, and he just wants to tell people's stories, whoever they are, in whatever genre or whatever. So he has written series, he has written, standalone books, and every time it's really the same skill set, isn't it? That you just want to tell stories, but you listen to the people that you decide to write about or you want to write about.
Yeah, I mean, people will give you this advice all the time. They'll say, write what you know. No, write what you're interested in. Write what gets you up in the morning, what you're excited about, what you're excited to learn about. Right? Write about that, because that will come through in your pages. That will come through to your readers. Right? Your characters will come alive because you're alive while you're writing it. And don't write to a genre, because, you know, when I was in practicing law and Scott Turow and John Grisham and were hitting it big, and then John Lasqua and then Phil Margolin, right? I was thinking, this is why I became a lawyer. It's all God's plan, right? I'm gonna write legal thrillers. You can't write for a genre, because you never know how long the genre is going to last, and except if you're writing vampires, right? Because
Dragons
and
at the
dragons,
moment.
dragons right now at the
Dragons
moment.
and great sex. That is romantasy. It
That's
really
the
is,
key.
right there.
So, you know, write what excites you. Write what you're interested in. And, you know, I have students in the class out here. I have a national seminar that I teach called the Novel Writing Intensive. And the students that are sitting out here that are successful, you know, you and in the back, they're people that wrote about something they were interested in. You know, they really were interested in Norway and in that Scandinavian life, and they wrote about it, and they wrote about it authentically and believable, and readers picked it up. I picked it up when I read it. It's believable, you know, and I think that's what most readers are looking for, right? You're looking for those characters that the best emails I get is when somebody says to me, "Is that a true story?" Because it means they believed my characters were alive.
Okay, but let's give a shout out to Gracie, because it's all very well for you to want to write stories in all genres and all, but for Gracie, it's a question of, you know, she's running a business. You have been amazing watching you take on all of these different things from Bob and making them work.
Oh, well, thanks. I mean, you know, I have to say, I think it's mostly about Bob and the stories that he's writing, but I do think there's one reason that you're able to successfully write multiple books a year and you have all these different great characters is, it really is. I mean, people want to follow these characters. And I think we were talking earlier about, you know, between David Sloan and Tracy Crosswhite and Charlie Jenkins, who was the star of, you know, your wonderful espionage trilogy, and Kira Duggan, who's in your newest books, and William Schumacher in A Killing on the Hill. I mean, I think there is some commonality. These are all different, you know, whether it's legal thrillers, police procedurals, espionage, there are some, or, you know, Sam Hell, even literary book club fiction. I mean, there are some commonalities between these characters, and I'd love to hear what you think about that, because I do feel that's, people kind of know what they're wanting when they pick up a Robert Dugoni novel.
Yeah, and I will say this. Gracie is so good at what she does that she keeps getting promoted. And I keep saying, I want her to edit my books. And so she keeps getting promoted, but she keeps taking me up with her, and I am eternally grateful for that. So thank you.
Take me up with you, so.
You know, A Killing on the Hill is a perfect example of what I've been talking about. I'm up in the attic, and I'm cleaning out the attic because I hate stuff. You know, I just want to get rid of stuff. It's so liberating. And I find these large books, and I open them up, and there's all these newspaper articles from 1933. And I'm like, what the heck are these things? So I go downstairs, and I said to my wife, what are these? And she said, they're my grandfather's scrapbooks. Her grandfather was a very prominent lawyer in Seattle in the 1930s and 1940s. So I sit down and I start flipping the pages and looking. And I come across a headline. It says something like, "Murder Trial Lawyers Clash." And I start to read about the killing of a lightweight boxer by a gangster who owns the Pom Pom nightclub on Profanity Hill.
Does anyone know where Profanity Hill is in Seattle?
It's Pill Hill. But they called it Profanity Hill because the old courthouse used to be at the top of the hill. And when the cars would break down, the trolley cars, to get up there, all the litigants, the judges, the lawyers, they had to climb 300 steps carrying all those heavy books. And they'd be swearing the whole way up. So it became known as Profanity Hill. Oh my God, how many of you out there who are all writers would have immediately gone, there's a story. And so I had this story, right? I had this great story, prohibition, bootlegging, right? And what I've just been talking about, excitement, right? I want to learn about this. I want to learn about Seattle bootleg. I want to learn about the Great Depression, Hooverville, all these things that are out there, all these, what were people going through? How could you have this nightclub that is described in these magazines as having tables of half-eaten meals, half-eaten steaks, half-eaten potatoes, half-eaten pieces of pie, mounds of cigarettes, cocktails all over them, and you have people starving in Hoovervilles? How does this happen? What was going on between the haves and the have-nots? I got to tell this story. So I start reading all the articles. I start doing all my research. I start doing all this stuff. And I'm going to write from the perspective of the defense lawyer. Of course I am. I'm a lawyer. This is perfect. I'm going to write from... And this guy just keeps coming into my head saying, no, you're not. No, you're not. You need a more objective viewpoint. You need somebody that is seeing this just as your readers are going to see it unfold. That this is a play on stage and nobody is telling the truth. And so this character, William Schumacher, comes into my head. He's a 19-year-old kid from Kansas City whose father, on his day of graduation, takes him outside and says, congratulations, I can no longer afford to feed you. During the Depression, your aunt is coming to live with us because she lost her husband to suicide. Good luck. Have you thought about the military? And his mother is horrified, and there's no way she's letting him go and join the military with all the shenanigans going on in Europe. So she calls a friend of a friend and gets a hold of the publisher, Howard Fishbaum, at the Seattle Daily Star, and gets her son a job as a stringer. And that's how he comes to Seattle. Where did this come from? I have no idea. I really don't.
And is this I think this is really the first time you've written a journalist character.
It's the first time I've written a journalist. I will say this. I remember I was 19 years old. I got out of Stanford University. The communications department recommended me to take an internship at the Los Angeles Times. I'm 19 years old, and I'm down there, and I walk into one of the premier newspapers in the country, if not the world. I can't tell you just how nervous I was, how scared I was. I mean, and that just all played into who is William Schumacher. Because think about it, he can't fail. There's a depression. His family is depending on him wiring some money home to them every time he gets a paycheck. He can't fail. And I remember that feeling so vividly.
And do you think, because you are, you're still writing Tracy Crosswhite. We've got a new Kira Duggan book coming this fall. William Schumacher just came out. Is there an element for you of going back and forth between these different characters and these different stories? Is that something that keeps it exciting for you?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Don't write the great American novel, right? F. Scott Fitzgerald already wrote it, okay? Write your novel and then write your next one, and then write your next one, because you never know what's going to hit. My first book never hit, didn't hit, right? It was the true story, The Cyanide Canary, that hit. Right, it's a true story about Southeast Idaho, and it got picked up, and I got an agent because of it. After my 42 rejections, it's a long story, but I wrote this true story with a former FBI agent. It got picked up, and you know what the first thing my agent said to me when I flew back to New York to meet her? What else have you got, kid? And I said, well, I have these 3 novels, but they're really not ready. I want to read them. I want to read them. 42 rejections, and I sent them. And a day and a half later, she called me up and said, they're brilliant. Really? Seriously? That's what I wanted to say to her. Now, I didn't say, well, they were rejected 42 times. So you never know. right? You never know. And the other thing I will say is never stop learning. Never stop learning. I was asked sort of in a roundabout way if I would jump in on a project and try to write a story, a World War II book for these guys that had done an incredible amount of research, but they just couldn't write it. And it's probably the most difficult thing I've ever done because I had to really create the story, but also keep some of what these guys have done because they work so hard on it. You know, I didn't want to just cut them out. And I sent the book off, and the book was edited, and the editor is here. And he wrote me back a 25-page editorial letter. And you know what I said to him? Thank you. Do you know how much work that was? And it's he's not doing it, it's to make my book better, to make it the best book that book can possibly be. And I learned so much from that letter just about writing my books and not trying to mold other people into it and pulling characters out. And so never stop learning. Never stop getting better. Never stop reading books on the craft, right? Go back and read books on the craft that you've read before and you'll find something else in them. But just always keep trying to go forward.
Well, on that line, I'm curious, you did write this trilogy with Charlie Jenkins, who is a retired CIA agent who gets pulled back into the life primarily in Russia. And that was something very, very different for you. You'd never written espionage. And The Eighth Sister, the first book in that trilogy, is one of my favorites of your books.
Oh, thank you.
And one of the things that blew me away when I read that manuscript was how much spycraft you had in there. I believed that actually, I know you're a good researcher, Bob, but I believed, wow, maybe Bob actually has some history that I don't know about because it was so real and there were so many interesting things that I hadn't read. And I read a lot of espionage thrillers that I hadn't read. And to your point about never keeping learning, can you talk a little about that? Felt like you were really stretching yourself and it turned out great. And what's the kind of importance in that?
I try to stretch myself on every book I write. I'll start a Tracy book and I'll say, I'm not writing from the first person, but I'm going to write every scene from her point of view. Every scene in the book is going to be from her point of view. And I'll do it because I feel like it helps me to grow as an author. I say yes to almost everything, almost. And the Charles Jenkins books are a good example. I got an email from a guy who said, I just read The Jurymaster, and I'm really curious about this character, Charles Jenkins. Well, he's a secondary character. Where did you get the information on him? I'd like to talk to you about it. Okay, and the answer to that is always, hell no. No, right? I don't know who this guy is. The next day he emails me and says, I just read the second book in the David Sloan series, and I'm really intrigued by this character, Charles Johnson. Well, this goes on literally in like 4 days. This guy has read the whole series. So I looked him up, and it turns out that he is a legitimate businessman at a pretty big business here in Bellevue. So I said, okay, I'll have coffee with you. And I set up a place to have coffee with him. And just before I was leaving my house to drive down to have coffee with this guy, I Googled the name. And I talked about this the other day, right? It turns out, right, when I finally get down there, I said, are you aware that there's a guy that has a name just like yours who's the only CIA officer ever acquitted of espionage in this country? And he said, that's me. And I said, tell me your story. And he helped me a lot. The other thing that happened was I got another email from a gentleman who said to me, I just read this book and it's incredibly accurate. Where did you get this info? Same thing, right? Short of a long story was I was going back to Washington, D.C. on behalf of Amazon, and this guy was from Virginia. And I said, hey, I'm going to be back there, do you want to meet? And he said, yeah. He said, if you take an Uber, it's going to be about a 45-minute drive. I said, that's okay. He said, well, meet me at my country club. I said, okay. So I go in there and I sit down and I'm looking around all the tables, and I'm looking for the CIA officer, right? I'm looking, I'm not, and all of a sudden this guy, the most unassuming human being you would ever meet in your life, tapped me on the shoulder and he introduces himself. And I said, oh my God, I never would have picked you out. And he said, no, you wouldn't have. And we started chatting, and I said, would you be willing to read my books for their accuracy? He said, I will, but you can never disclose my name or that I did it, because if you do, your book will be vetted by the CIA. So I never have. But again, that was simply saying yes to somebody, being cautious about it, but saying yes to somebody and hearing what he had to say.
And also a good example of sort of creating a story between things that you learned and people that you met and research that you did, but also, if I recall, some of your own experience, because you had traveled to Russia.
Yeah. I've been very fortunate and blessed to travel almost all over the world. Not as much as Barb, but a lot of really...
You're not as old.
A lot of really wonderful places. I have a brother-in-law that puts these trips together, and so I get a chance for me to see my brothers and my sisters. But early on in the 90s, just sort of when Perestroika was going on, the woman who sang at my wedding, at my wife and my wedding, was a former Russian opera singer who had defected. And she was going home for the first time to see her family. And she said to my wife's mother, if you would like to go, I can help you get into the country. And so we went. And we went to Moscow, we went to St. Petersburg, we went to Sigorsk, and some other places, but we didn't stay in hotels. We stayed in people's homes, in their apartments, because there were 4 couples, and if we each paid them $50 a night, in a week they could make what they make in a year. So we lived as Russian people would live. And to this day, I've been fortunate and blessed to go to Africa. I've been fortunate and blessed to go to China, Egypt, South America. Russia is the most unusual and interesting place I have ever been. You would be on the street and you'd be lost, and you'd walk up to someone, a Russian person, and you say, I forget how you say excuse me. You'd say excuse me in Russian, and they would immediately look at you like, and you say, can you show me how to get here? And they put their guard down and they'd smile and they'd say, come. And even if they were going this direction and you were going that direction, they would walk you and they would take us where we needed to be, smiling and the whole time. It was a fascinating country. And so to be able to go back to that and bring in those little aspects that I learned when I was there was really wonderful.
Yeah, I think that's one thing that makes your books stand out is these elements of everyday life, whether you're writing about Russia or Tracy Crosswhite's life raising her young daughter. I think one of the things in it, Killing on the Hill, I mean, you just get such a rich sense of Seattle in 1933. I mean, of course, we have Schumacher and we have the case is very interesting, but I actually also learned a lot about my own city. And one thing, this is a little bit of an aside, but one thing that you told me that I thought was so fascinating was that we didn't have organized crime. We didn't have the mob in Seattle. There might have been gangsters,
yeah.
but that we didn't have that in Seattle because the police were so corrupt, yeah, that the mob didn't want to come in.
Yeah.
And where is that something, where did that come from?
So just in the research is Al Capone. You know, why would Al Capone not have extended out into this area? Bootlegging was huge in Seattle. And you know who the #1 bootlegger was in Seattle? I can't remember his name, but he was a former police lieutenant.
He had a large house up on Mount Baker.
Yeah, and the joke used to be that he commanded more police officers as a bootlegger than he had as a lieutenant. And so Al Capone was like, there's no point going there. And I told this story, I don't know if I told it here, but Wyatt Earp, at the turn of the century, Wyatt Earp came to Seattle and opened a gambling establishment. And he lasted 1 month because he refused to pay the police officers. So all the other gambling establishments said, we're not going to pay you then. And so they kicked Wyatt Earp out so that they could still have all that stuff going on.
So one thing Bob hasn't talked about, he's talked about stories that have fallen into his lap or stories that have, for other reasons, come to him. But when we were at lunch, I asked him about the choreography of the really astonishing plot, and I can't remember the name. Tell me again. Her Deadly Game. Thank you. The first. Thank you. It's my age. I just can't remember stuff. But anyway, I couldn't believe that Bob. And this is no offense to you, but I couldn't believe that Bob knew enough about how to set this up to have written it without help. So I asked him, and you said, indeed, you reached out for help. It wasn't like anybody came to you in order for you to do that really astonishing book.
Yeah, don't ever hesitate to ask people questions. I think it was Jeff Ayers who pointed it out in his panel the other day, where he just calls people up. He called up people in the Park Service and says, "Can I talk to you about your job?" I mean, think about how flattering that is. Really, you're a park ranger and somebody calls you up and says, "Geez, can I talk to you about your job?" And I had met a guy at the Pacific Northwest Riders Association, and he came up and talked to me. He was a former police officer for the Edmonds Police Department. And unfortunately, one of my contacts at the Seattle Police Department died very tragically at 48 years of age of pancreatitis. And so I had lost that connection. And so I called up Alan and I said, "Listen, I got a favor to ask." I said, "I want to create a character, I don't want to get too much into it, I want to create a character who commits suicide, but the police are suspect about it." And he said, "Let me get back to you." So he called me back and said, "Okay, my buddy's a mechanical engineer. When can you meet?" And I went and I met and I sat down with them and they were more excited than I was. Like, okay, here's how we can do it. And Lee Goldberg tells a similar story where I think it was in Malibu Burning, where he has an arsonist and he had to create a way of setting fires that could not be detected. And he went and he talked to an arson expert and the guy swore at him. And Jeff said, whoa, what do you get swearing at him? He goes, "Because it would work." So never be afraid to ask people questions. The worst thing they can say is no.
So I have a question for Gracie. Given the fact that Bob finds a story every week somewhere, how do you control or how do you schedule his books? There's something called cadence, right? I mean, he can only publish so many books a year.
Yeah, I mean, I view my job as Bob wants to write what he wants to write, and I want you to write what you want to write, because as we've been talking about, what you're passionate about and interested in is going to make the best book. So my job is just to make sure, A, that we can make sure those are the best possible books, and B, that we do a great job publishing them. And it can get, when you are as prolific as Bob is and have all of these great characters that readers love, it's a what I think of as a champagne problem, right? Where it's like, wow, we don't want to stop any of these series. We want to keep publishing them, but keep publishing them in a way. I mean, we do have a little bit of a rule of thumb in terms of when you're writing a series, you don't want too long to go on between books in the series. So making sure we're scheduling, that we want to have a Tracy Crosswhite book every 12 to 18 months at most, and we also want to leave room for Kira Duggan or Charlie Jenkins or William Schumacher or whatever your next idea is and your next character. So that's a little bit of a scheduling thing that we do, but I mean what it comes down to is the wonderful element of that none of these characters are thus far ones that readers are tired of.
Yeah, I mean, Gracie's being a little humble because it was Gracie who said to me, "What do you think about writing another legal thriller?" And I said, "I would love to do it, but I would like to do it in my own style," meaning family dynamics, right? The Duggan family, her father's a terrible alcoholic. She's completely dysfunctional. Her sisters are completely dysfunctional, and they're all working in the same law firm. I want to have police procedural aspects to it because I love writing about, police stuff to it. And then I want to have the courtroom drama, which I love writing about the courtroom drama stuff too. So that was a suggestion by Gracie. And Her Deadly Game has just done incredibly well. It's been nominated by ITW for one of the top 5 thrillers of the year, and we'll find out in end of May if it wins or not. But that really was at Gracie's impetus. She said, "Why don't you think about it?"
Yeah, but you came up with Kira all on your own and made her a chess master all on your own.
Anyway, I guess we're out of time, but I guess the thing that I would like to leave you with, and hopefully that you take this the right way, is it was not that long ago when I was sitting out there. It really was not that. I remember it distinctly and hearing people like John Lasqua and other people up here talk. So to me, it's a really humbling moment. It's a really humbling time in my life to be sitting up here, supposedly imparting hopefully some word of wisdom. But the one thing that I will leave you with is persistence, patience, and perseverance. And if you are a person of faith, I would add prayer, which I am. Because you never know when that moment is going to strike. So you need to have a little bit of luck, but you also need to be prepared for it. And thanks so much for coming, and I wish you the best of luck, all of you.